Hey guys, it's Rachel again, and I'm going to continue talking about my experience having a trigeminal schwannoma. But this time I'm going to be focusing more on how I made the decision to go through with my craniotomy despite the fact that I hadn't been showing any symptoms, and what I did to prepare for the craniotomy. So just so you guys have a frame of reference, I found out that I had a trigeminal schwannoma in 2012, and I had the craniotomy in 2021. So that's the amount of time in between finding out and going through with the craniotomy. Again, no symptoms this entire time, just something that I was dealing with emotionally and mentally and trying to navigate with that in mind. My neurosurgeon actually offered to reach out to somebody who had a trigeminal schwannoma and the subsequent craniotomy as well to see if they would be open to communicating with me about their experiences. This person ended up never getting back to my neurosurgeon as far as I'm concerned, and that's part of the reason why I decided to do these videos, because I wanted to make sure that there was some sort of recollection of what the experience was like. Even though everybody's experience is going to be different, it might be nice to just have this as a reference. Even though I wasn't having any physical symptoms from my trigeminal schwannoma, I had noticed that I was showing like psychological symptoms, in the sense of it was kind of getting to me knowing that eventually I was gonna have to have this operation done. So it wasn't necessarily that the tumor was pressing on a part of my brain that was making me behave in some crazy ways, but it was more like I wasn't taking advantage of certain opportunities for fear that I would start showing symptoms and all of a sudden I would need to have my operation. So for example, I was in college, it was my freshman year of college, and I got accepted into the study abroad program, and I was really excited about it, but I didn't end up pursuing that because I was worried about, what if I started having double vision and not being able to navigate myself around on my own?
Ouch!
And would I have to go back to the US, and is that just a term completely wasted, but I still have to spend all of this money on the study abroad program? So on and so forth. That was just an opportunity that I ended up missing out on, which is, it's sad, but my concerns were valid, so I don't necessarily regret it for the knowledge that I had at the time, but that wasn't like the only situation where I was missing out on opportunities because I was too in my head about what was in my head.
You suck!
By the time that I decided I wanted to go through with the craniotomy, the COVID lockdown was already in place. So this was the end of 2020, and I had already been working from home for a little bit. So once I was relatively functional, I knew that I would be able to work from home. I wouldn't have to go places. I didn't have to expose myself to potential viruses or bacteria that could hinder my recovery process. And so I was kind of thinking, this might just be like the perfect opportunity for me to get something like this taken care of. And because I was able to work from home at this time, I was also able to save a bunch of time off, and that was really helpful for making sure that I was able to continue to be paid a little bit through my more long-term recovery process. I was also living with people who I really trusted to have a lot of compassion and take care of me. I was living with my partner of a couple of years at that point, and we had discussed getting married before, so this was like already a serious relationship. And I had actually put off getting married because of my craniotomy, because I was worried that, worst case scenario, we get married, something happens, my spouse would have to then deal with all of the financial consequences, and maybe if I was disabled further than what I already am, they would find themselves feeling stuck with a partner who they feel like they have to take care of and maybe would be more of a responsibility than they'd want. That's not how they saw it, but I didn't want that to be the situation for them. So that was another thing that I kind of put off until after I had my craniotomy. In the decision-making process, I had the privilege of being able to speak with one of my friends who I know had recently had a life-altering operation, and this was an operation that wasn't like a sudden, like this has to happen right now situation, but it was one where this person knew they would have to have the operation, but it didn't have to be an immediate thing, so they ultimately made that decision in their time. So I was able to talk with them about, like, when did you know it was the right time for you? Even though our operations totally not comparable, there's still like life-altering situations, and making that big decision could have a lot of different consequences, and I wanted to know what their thought process was in making that decision, and I found that really helpful too. As fucked up as it is that this was a consideration at all, this was also the last year that I was going to be on my parents' insurance, and that was definitely a consideration as well for me. So I just want to point out how fucked up it is that there are people who are dealing with life-altering situations who might make a decision based off of the age that they're in and whether or not their parents' insurance would cover their medical expenses. So I'm just going to call that out. And for those of you who haven't already guessed or assumed by this point, I am dealing with the American medical system. So, yeah, not great. So all of these things kind of piled on to create the perfect storm, if you will, for me to feel at ease making this life-altering decision to have my craniotomy in early 2021. I think I ended up scheduling the craniotomy about like 6 months out. So that would be, I think it was like September, I was able to schedule my craniotomy. And in that time, I definitely had multiple conversations with my neurosurgeon and other doctors just to go over what should I be expecting, how can I prepare best, what are the stipulations for having an operation during COVID. So hopefully this isn't the situation for you whenever you have your operation. But I was only able to have one designated visitor for the entire time I was going to be in the hospital, which was expected to be about 5 days. So when it comes to preparing for the craniotomy, I actually had been doing research since the first day that I found out I had a trigeminal schwannoma. And as I said in the last video that I did, there's not a whole lot of research out there. So I also started doing research on trigeminal neuralgia, different types of schwannomas, the trigeminal nerve, and as I got closer to having the craniotomy, I was doing more research on neuroregeneration and the healing process and different like foods and exercises and practices that might help the healing process in general, as well as things that might help the healing process of the nervous system. But I don't expect anybody to want to do as much research as I did. I would generally trust your doctor, but I do know that some people have good reason to not trust their doctors, so by all means, do your own research if you have the capacity to. If not, I'm hoping that someday I'll be able to get all of the research I was able to find and kind of do a review of all of that, but I'm not going to say I will for sure because I don't know if I'll have the capacity for that. Neuroplasticity was actually one of the most fascinating topics that I started researching, which was especially neat, again, because I ended up being a psychology major, so that was just kind of like perfectly on par for me. For those of you who may not know already, neuroplasticity is, quote, the ability of the nervous system to change its activity in response to intrinsic or extrinsic stimuli by reorganizing its structure, functions, or connections after injuries such as stroke or traumatic brain injury. So that's why I was particularly fascinated with neuroplasticity and how to boost that. One way that you can boost neuroplasticity is actually through meditating, which was something that I was always kind of interested in, but never really like had a whole lot of reason to super pursue, because I grew up in a grinding culture. Wow. I grew up in a society that prioritized productivity above all, and not moving and clearing your mind isn't viewed as financially gainful, I guess. So I never really thought to just do it. But as it turns out, even if it doesn't boost the economy, it can actually help your brain out tremendously. So I started meditating regularly, like daily, a month or two at least before I knew I was going to have my craniotomy. Meditating is not only good for neuroplasticity, but it's also good for helping regulate and process emotions. And it's also something that you can do while stretching and doing yoga and whatnot. In fact, yoga originated as a spiritual act that was used to connect your mind and your body and your soul, but we don't really talk about that in Western society as much as I think we should. But that's beside the point. So I started doing yoga, I started meditating, and really just focusing on my vessel, my body. In that same vein, I also started making more conscious decisions about my consumption habits. I stopped drinking alcohol, I stopped smoking nicotine, I slowed down my weed intake. I got my medications regulated. I was taking a certain antidepressant that I think was making my night sweats really bad, so I got that altered to try to help me get a better night of sleep, and I made sure to do that with plenty of time for my body to adjust from getting off of this medication and getting onto that medication. I made sure that my medications were refilled before I went into the hospital for the craniotomy. My grandpa also recommended that I get blue light blocking glasses to help me sleep. So the process behind that is blue light triggers something in your mind that convinces you that it is daytime, and therefore it can kind of mess up your circadian cycle in a way that makes it harder for you to fall asleep if you're looking at a screen without blue light blocking glasses an hour or two before bedtime. So I started wearing blue light blocking glasses a couple of hours before I'd fall asleep as well. Sleep is actually like the most important thing for your health, so that's one of the reasons why I was super focused on trying to get a good night of sleep. By the time that I had my craniotomy scheduled, we would be going into the office maybe once or twice a week, so I made sure that I cleared it with my boss that I could work from home 2 weeks before the operation, because I didn't want to risk getting COVID and further have to postpone this operation. If you have the privilege of being able to work from home, that might be something that you clear with them, because honestly, having any sort of ailment or illness before going into any sort of operation is not a good deal. It doesn't matter if it's COVID or not, and I think 2 weeks is a reasonable time frame to ask to work from home, but I also know that's not realistic for a lot of people, unfortunately. And because I knew that this was going to be kind of a stressful situation, and this was like a big deal and a major mile marker in my life, I had the privilege of having a short little weekend vacation set up before my craniotomy, just a couple of days before my craniotomy. And it also happened to fall on Valentine's Day, so that was nice. Me and my partner were able to go to a cute little house that we rented just for the weekend, and it was in the middle of nowhere, and it was in the middle of winter, and it was just me and my partner who I was already living with, so I wasn't making any risks about getting any infections of any sort. And we just, stepped away from our devices for a bit. We played some pool, we took some pictures because it was snowy in the mountains, it was beautiful, and just really enjoyed each other's company and had a peaceful time. And I was journaling, and you know, it was nice. We had some really nice conversations. Right, journaling. I started journaling pretty much the second that I decided that I was going to have a craniotomy, partly, again, as a way to process my emotions, but also as a way to look back on my experiences and perhaps recall them to people who may be looking for some frame of reference in the future. And that has served me very well for these videos. But whether or not you're making videos, I do encourage you to journal if you have the time and capacity. I just think journaling is just a good idea in general, but I'm not your boss. I definitely made sure to take time to cry, which was really hard for me at the time, and I'm getting better about crying. Ugh, it's so exhausting, but it's necessary. You gotta let it out. I'd talked to my partner at the time, spouse now, so if I say spouse, that's who I'm talking about. I talked to them about my concerns. I was worried about becoming a burden. I was mostly just worried about becoming a burden. That's really what it came down to. Which is, you know, its own thing, but there are people in your life who are never going to view you as a burden, so just take solace in that. And make sure that those are the people who you are surrounded by whenever you do go through with whatever operation you're going through with. I definitely made sure to completely disengage with any and all social media right before my operation. I didn't want that to be on the back of my mind, and admittedly at this time I was regularly getting in arguments with feds. So I was more reactionary than I would like to admit, but there I am. I'm admitting it. But I didn't, I couldn't afford to have that stress in my mind when I'm going through a craniotomy. So I made sure to address that by stepping away from any and all social media at that time. One thing that my neurosurgeon told me to be prepared for was the possibility that I would have a hard time communicating. And that was because in order to get to the tumor, they would need to remove the part of the brain that is used to produce language. I thought it would be a good idea to start teaching my spouse some American Sign Language, because if I can't produce language verbally, maybe I'll be able to produce language more like physically with my hands. That's actually not the case. After doing some research, producing language with your hands is done in the same area of the brain as producing language with your mouth. It makes sense. But I was hopeful. I was hopeful that I was being clever, but I don't regret it, because my spouse now knows that this means water. So if for some reason I'm not able to talk verbally and I need water, it works. 3, like that. So there's an unnecessary fact for you. I also had a friend who had recently had a brain bleed and had to go in for an emergency operation just a year or 2 before I had my craniotomy, and so I was able to reach out to him as well to see if they had any experiences that they would advise me of. And one of them was, they knew that I was a stoner, so they were like, hey, weed messes with your blood pressure, which could mess with your recovery process, so you should wean yourself off of weed before going in for the operation. And I obliged, as much as it pained me at the time. While I was processing a lot of my emotions, one thing that I complained about a lot was the fact that despite how absolutely privileged I am, and I knew that I was still worried about how I was going to be able to afford living after my craniotomy. How fucked up is that? Like, if I'm already having to deal with getting a craniotomy, I think it should just be a given that I'm gonna be able to afford the craniotomy somehow, and I'm going to be able to afford to take time to recover from a craniotomy. I think it's absurd that, spoiler alert, I ended up going back to work, I think 2 weeks after I had my craniotomy, and part of that was because I genuinely couldn't afford to not be working. Granted, I was able to go back part-time instead of full-time, so that was, a small mercy. And I don't resent my boss or anything because of it. I just resent the current systems we reside under in America. Again, like, I'm very thankful for the privileges that I had at the time, because, if any of those privileges were not given to me, I may not have been able to go through with it. Also, FMLA is unpaid, so be prepared for that. And if you can, try to have a backup plan. But ultimately, I did want to maintain a more positive outlook on things, so I wasn't thinking about, I wasn't envisioning my life with the worst case scenario, except for those times really when I was processing the potentials. So instead, I would focus more on what tattoo am I gonna get as a result of this, like a celebratory tattoo that I want to get, and like thinking about, when are we gonna get married? What are we gonna do about that? So if you have anything that you're really looking forward to after your craniotomy, I think it was a good practice for me to kind of mentally and emotionally focus on that, just to make sure that you're not giving up, to put it bluntly. Make sure that you're not. It's tough because on one hand, like, yes, you should be prepared for the worst case scenario, but don't put yourself there mentally. I don't really know how else to phrase it. I guess be prepared to celebrate a victory at least just as much as you are prepared for a worst case scenario. And spend more time focusing on the things you're excited for than the things that could go wrong. Because if those things go wrong, there's not really a whole lot that you can do about that. So there's really no point in worrying. Because this was during the COVID lockdown, I had actually put on a little bit of weight before my operation, which in the end was a good thing, because after my operation, I was having a really hard time eating. And I'll go more into the specifics as to why that was in my next video, but I ended up kind of relying on those Ensure nutritional drinks for a while after I had my craniotomy. So I would be prepared to lose and or gain weight, because you're also not going to be able to lift weights after your craniotomy. Your mobility may be hindered after your craniotomy, or heaven forbid there's another lockdown. But I would definitely talk to your neurosurgeon and talk to your doctors about potential ways you can prepare for that. Maybe there's a specific diet you can consider. Maybe you should like stock up on Ensures or something like that. But that's something that you should be mentally and emotionally prepared for, which I know kind of sounds weird. If you're having a craniotomy, like, your weight should be the last thing that you're worried about, but that is, it's important to make sure that you are able to consume the nutrition that you need in order to have an optimal recovery. There were a few things that I ended up buying to help with my recovery process. One of them was a wedge pillow, because in my situation, at least, they wanted to make sure I was sleeping on an incline to kind of help with the blood flow. Apparently that helps with the recovery process somehow. I don't remember the specifics about that. So I already knew that I'd need to get the wedge pillow in order to be able to sleep on an incline. So I went through HSA, because I figured that would be HSA eligible, and thankfully it was. And then I remembered that I have an HSA account, so I might as well use that, and so I bought what I thought was a neck massager pillow, but it ended up being an LED neck pillow that would shine like red LED lights, and that's actually been more beneficial than I could have imagined. I also got an SAD lamp, a SAD lamp, or a seasonal affective disorder lamp, because I figured I probably wouldn't be able to go outside as much as I would want to. Part of the reason is for optimal recovery for the scar, which I'll show better in another video probably. But it's not supposed to be super exposed to the sunlight, so if you're not outside a whole bunch, then you're not getting all of the vitamins that you need, and that can make you super depressed. And I didn't want to be super depressed, so I got this lamp, which was also HSA eligible. Yeah, so all of this stuff was HSA eligible. If you have an HSA or an FSA account, I encourage you dip into that to help you prepare for whatever operation you're dealing with. And maybe just like buy yourself something nice. That's really all I can think of at this point in time as far as ways that I prepared for the craniotomy. If I think of anything further, I might make a couple shorter subsequent videos, but I did review my journal, so I doubt that I'll be able to think of anything. If you stumble upon this video and you've had a major operation and there are other ways you can think of that you prepared for this operation, please leave a comment. I would super appreciate that. It might serve somebody in the future very well, just to know what little piece of advice you might have, whether or not you think it's super important. I'm hoping that you just stumbled upon this video and are watching it for your sick entertainment purposes, but if that's not the case and you are going to be going through with some sort of procedure, I will be wishing you a happy procedure. I hope the drugs treat you well, and have a swift recovery. See you on the other side.